folks, in this video I'll be talking a little bit about the existential approach to psychology and psychotherapy. I have four main points that I'd like to make, and those are to provide a brief overview of existentialism as a philosophy, a brief overview of how that's impacted psychology and social psychology research in particular, existentialism as an approach to psychotherapy, and then lastly, why on earth I would be talking about this now given the current situation. So let's get started. First, I'll say that existentialism is a rather broad area of philosophy. It actually touches on many different fields, including cultural anthropology, social movements. It's a pretty broad set of ideas. But if we were to distill it down to some of the things that are most relevant for us, one of the key features would be the idea that existence precedes essence. What we mean by this is the idea that human beings don't come with an inherent plan or design, like, say, a pair of scissors does. It was built to cut things. Human beings have to decide for themselves what they are. We are self-aware, cognizant of our surroundings. We have to determine for ourselves what is meaningful to us, what we want to do with our lives, how to choose our behavior. And that's sort of unique to being a human being. Existentialism explores many other ideas, but one of the core driving things is sort of the uniqueness of being alive and existing and knowing that we exist, right? So whereas an ant, a grasshopper, a snake may not be contemplating these sorts of questions like, what do I do with my life? Human beings are sort of uniquely positioned to worry about that, and so we try to figure out what to do with ourselves. That's all encapsulated in this idea that existence precedes essence. Another key idea is that of choice. So along the same lines, humans have to make choices, and we are aware of those choices, and we're bright enough to be able to predict possible outcomes of those choices. And so anytime we make a choice, we are removing the possibility of a nearly infinite set of other choices that we could have made. And so we have to constantly sort of live with that weight of choosing how to be. And a number of philosophers in the existential tradition, de Beauvoir, Sartre, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Camus, they argued that this is one of the, if not the biggest responsibility of human beings, is to authentically, mindfully, purposefully choose, to choose who you are, what you want to be, in a big sense in terms of what you might like to do as a career or what you believe, and then also in many, many small instances in terms of what you do on a day-to-day basis. Another key idea is the idea of absurdity. Camus in particular talked about the idea that the rules in life are rather absurd. We're not entirely sure why we're here, we're not entirely sure what to do with ourselves or what to believe or how to exist. We just know that we do, and we have to keep choosing to exist on a day-to-day basis, despite the fact that there's a lot outside of our control, there's a lot that doesn't make sense to us, and we're just sort of doing our best. There's a lot of pain and suffering involved, and we just seem to keep choosing to muddle through it. It's all rather absurd. We have a lot of big feelings about a lot of very murky, ambiguous things. So existentialism as a philosophy is sort of about acknowledging all of that, stating and making explicit much of what is complicated and heavy for people, but often goes untalked about. Okay, the second thing I'd like to point out is how existentialism has informed psychology. And there are a number of important authors I'd like to point out as far as that goes. Folks like Ernest Becker, Niemeyer, Greenberg, Solomon, Paczynski, who sort of together, along with a few other authors, really spearheaded the social psychology movement of existentialism, and others as well, right? This is a big area. One of the key notions in how existentialism has impacted psychology is through studying death anxiety. Death anxiety is specifically the fear or apprehension about one's mortality. Now, this is not a diagnosable form of anxiety like some of the other things that you might be studying. This is more treated as a personality construct in general, motivating factor, a variable of interest in many different ways. Death anxiety as a personality variable has drawn interest from researchers for over 100 years. They've been finding that it's correlated to a number of other personality constructs, such as neuroticism, and also that it's predictive of various kinds of behaviors, some adaptive and safety-oriented, and others, counterintuitively, can be self-destructive. Another key way that existentialism is relevant to psychology as a science is through what's called terror management theory. This theory, developed by Solomon, Greenberg, Buczynski, and others in response to Becker's work, essentially states that our fears, apprehensions, uncertainties about life and death cause us to engage in a whole widespread array of behaviors to help us deny those things which we are so concerned about. In other words, all of human culture is essentially a reaction to our fear of dying and a way to help us avoid thinking about that. Everything from traditions, holidays, cheering for sports teams, basically everything we do to connect with something greater than ourselves, to garner a sense of self-esteem, and to feel connected to other people is essentially a way to mitigate our own fears about death and dying. While some aspects of terror management theory have been called into question recently due to replication issues, it still is the case that dozens and dozens of studies over the past 30 to 40 years have cumulatively built up this notion that humans are working very hard all of the time to remain unaware of our own eventual death and dying. An integral part of terror management theory is that we garner self-esteem from the standards of one's culture. So we are constantly working to have a great amount of self-esteem because this allows us to feel that we're part of something permanent, part of something greater than ourselves, and part of something that allows us to, at least metaphorically or in the abstract, outlive death. And so these researchers argue that our cultural worldview as a whole is an effort to avoid death, an avoidance of thinking about it, an avoidance of having to worry about it, right? Again, because we are part of something permanent. An artist creating something, right? The idea is that it could last forever, or at least conceptually permanent. The probably biggest example would be child rearing, right? At our core, we're all hoping to escape death and live beyond it somehow. And raising our own children is probably the greatest example of people's attempts to do this. So a lot of work has gone into tying existentialism as a philosophy into psychological science, particularly through the lenses of personality and social psychology. But in particular, the thing I really wanted to talk about today was how existentialism is relevant to counseling and psychotherapy. There are a number of authors that have been really influential to the field and to me in particular. Those include Irvin Yalom. His text, Existential Psychotherapy, has been a really enormous part of my thinking and my training. And there are other authors that have done a really nice job of intertwining these ideas. One is Rachel Menzies. Her book, Curing the Dread of Death, is also really relevant and really helpful in this area. But let's just go over some of the key notions that an existentially oriented therapist would have in mind. Yalom outlines 4 key ideas in his text. The first is meaninglessness. So the idea that there's actually no inherent meaning in life. And this is tied back to that other notion of existence preceding essence. In other words, humans don't come with a blueprint. We don't come with a set of rules and guidelines that say, this is what matters, this is what you should be doing at any given time, this is how you should live your life. Certainly human cultures, as far back as history goes, show evidence of us attempting to write such cultural narrative scripts. We give ourselves a lot of rules, but there is no inherent set of meaning that we are born with that guides us, right? Humans have worked really hard to create it themselves, but at least in any sort of scientific way, we've not yet found an inherent or pre-existing set of meanings upon which we have joined. It's just us trying to figure it out. And that can be really frightening for a lot of people, right? So they throw themselves into work, they throw themselves into all sorts of different endeavors and pursuits in the belief that it's meaningful, but ultimately they are choosing to believe that it has meaning. There's no grand guide or source of meaning that we can turn to, at least not something that all humans uniformly have been able to agree upon. Secondly, Yalom argues that a really relevant idea is isolation. Not just spending time apart from one another socially, but an existentially oriented idea of isolation. The idea that you and only you are experiencing your life. Your entire subjectivity is limited to what's between your ears, right? Your brain, your mind is what experiences your life. And this is from tiny little things like enjoying a favorite food of yours and wishing that your partner might be able to taste it the same way you do, to big things, right? Major cultural events like a wedding day. You're experiencing it the way you are, and your partner is experiencing it the way they are. And even though you might be standing just inches apart while you're saying your vows, it's ultimately experienced individually. You are isolated to your own mind. You wake up by yourself every day, you fall asleep by yourself every day. You are just you. And despite our desire to connect with others, we're always relying on some vehicle to do that, whether it's language, whether it's imagery, and we're hoping that the other person can grasp it the way we experience it. But that's always a bit of a guess, a bit of an assumption, and it's never quite 100% linked up. Third thing that Yalom argues is really difficult for people is this notion of freedom. Now that on the surface might sound like a good thing, right? Rah, rah, freedom. But actually he says freedom, like this idea of choice that we talked about earlier, is really heavy for people because while we have the freedom to make our own decisions, we are also aware that we have to sit with the consequences of those decisions. Everything from choosing your major, choosing whether to stay with a partner that you had earlier in life, choosing jobs, choosing whether to raise a family. You're free to figure it out in your own way, but then you're stuck with the choices that you made, right? So at any given moment, you are choicefully doing one certain thing, and an infinitum of other versions of you are killed off. So that's really weighty for us. It's really hard to sit with the idea that we bear the burden of our own freedom. Okay, and lastly, and probably most obviously, Yalom talks about the idea of death being relevant to us. Death is a relevant construct for therapists to be thinking about because it is, again, as I've been saying this whole time, intertwined with everything in life. Sometimes in obvious ways, your clients will come in with concerns about death because either they are sick, or they're getting older, or they're dealing with the loss of a loved one. But oftentimes, death is relevant in abstract ways, right? So retirement, breakups, major life changes where hobbies and habits have to be rebuilt. These are all sort of experienced like a miniature sort of death, if you will. And Yalom talks a lot about how death is not just something that's important for the elderly, it's a part of everyone's life, and it's really pretty constant. But again, like I've been saying, we do a lot to try to not think about it. So those are the four things that Yalom talks about: freedom, isolation, meaninglessness, and death. Now you might be kind of thinking, how on earth is that therapeutic, right? How is that good for a therapist to be thinking of those constructs as they encounter a client? Well, this is where we can really turn this and make it into something healing and productive. Yalom and other existentially oriented therapists talk about the healing power of acceptance, of working through and accepting these givens, these truths in life. By accepting rather than trying to constantly deny these things to ourselves, you are actually given a greater sense of freedom. You are relinquishing the fight, if you will. Rather than constantly trying to make it not so, if we just lean into it and say, yep, I am going to die eventually. I am experiencing life alone. It is true that these things that I think about a lot are probably not actually all that meaningful in the grand scope of things. If we can accept those, and we can see that we truly are just dust in the wind, we're just existing on this pale blue dot in the middle of nowhere, suddenly all of our woes feel a little bit smaller. Suddenly we're sort of able to take a deep breath and say, maybe it's not a big deal. It really allows us to reframe, right? So Yalom and other therapists talk a lot about this idea of accepting these core truths in life. Another idea is authenticity. So the philosophers, the therapists, the social scientists alike, they've all sort of come to an agreement that it's an important idea to live an authentic life. And what this refers to is the idea of being purposeful, of making informed, mindful choices about how you'd like to spend your life. And that if we are accepting all these other difficult things that we've talked about, and then in spite of that, or maybe even empowered by that, choosing to live in certain ways, then those ways of living are probably healthier ways. They're probably more important and more meaningful to us. Right? So consider a workaholic who's always doing 12-hour days, responding to emails feverishly. If this individual sat down and thought through what's most important to me, is this what I want to be remembered for? They might change their behavior, right? They might spend a little more time with friends and family. They might connect to philanthropy. They might be more service-oriented. Okay? So living authentically is another key notion that sort of runs through an existentially informed therapy. I should probably point out, existential psychotherapy is not a step-by-step model. It is inherently subjective, right? It is going to be different from person to person. So this is not the sort of thing where you can expect to purchase a manual and follow it chapter by chapter with your clients. Instead, it's a lens, a framework, a way of thinking about life and about human suffering, such that we can really humanistically and empathically connect to one another. Okay, lastly, I'll address the question that might be on your mind this whole time. Why on earth are we talking about existential dread and angst during a pandemic? Isn't this torture? Why would I bring this up? Let me try and make a case for why it's relevant today just as much as it's relevant any other day. What we're talking about are difficult but timeless truths. If you're watching this in the future, great, congrats, I'm glad you're doing well. But if you're watching this now, you're probably aware that we are amidst a global health crisis, right? The coronavirus or COVID-19 is impacting all of our lives. So you might be thinking, how on earth should we be reading about death anxiety right now? Isn't that already on the top of everyone's minds? I think it's relevant because it's always been relevant. The pandemic is just making us more aware of it. So it's actually sort of an existential prime or an opportunity, right, to embrace authenticity. This is an opportunity to be a little more choiceful, right, with how we're spending our lives. The rules have not changed just because of this pandemic. It is still the case that everyone will eventually die, you and everyone you love. It is still the case that we are isolated. Now we're just social distancing, which kind of adds another layer to it, but it's always been true that we are existentially isolated. You might be sitting there thinking, during a pandemic, my studies don't feel very meaningful. Well, it's always been true that they're not meaningful, unless you choose to find them meaningful, right? If you're authentically living your life in a way where you're choosing what's most important to you, whether it's a pandemic or not, then you can sort of sit back, breathe deeply, and say, oh, I'm doing the best I can, right? Life is ultimately pretty absurd. Just keep trying. So, that's my spiel about that, is that ultimately existentialism is a timeless framework, it's a timeless worldview, if you will, and that it has a lot to offer for clients or just the other people in your lives who might be struggling with everything that's going on right now. I personally find it a healing reminder to sort of walk myself through this thought process and say, look, zoom out a little bit. This is how it's always been. Everything is in flux, everything is fragile, and that's okay. I can accept that and I can work with that. Okay, so if you've made it this far, thank you for watching. That's a really brief overview of existentialism in psychotherapy. I hope it's helpful for you. Have an awesome day.